Hey folks, the topic for this video is going to be on the gods. Now, what are the gods in heathenry? So these are really powerful spiritual beings who are vital to the cosmology functioning, and they may or may not be worshipped by humans. Any god or goddess is going to be involved in some kind of cosmological function, whether they're a great big god that has their hands deep in how the universe functions, or whether they're a goddess of a river or the goddess of a tree, or the god of a river or the god of a tree. Now, the gods may or may not have gender, they may or may not have the cosmological functions that we appreciate. For instance, people will often look at certain and say, well, why would you worship that? Well, because it's the first being, it's a god of fire, and we wouldn't be where we are as human beings without that first fire. So a god may or may not be worshipped by everybody, but it certainly is recognized as a great power, as we call them in Norse Heathenry, Ginregen, mighty powers. So what kinds of gods are there? Well, the interesting bit is that you can have gods that other people might relate to as spirits. So for instance, people might say, oh, that's a big spirit of the river, whereas you relate to it as a god, because what it does is it takes care of or is the river. That's its cosmological function. Now, not everything has to have a single or a grouped cosmological function like god of. It can be very limiting. So many of our gods have multiple attributes. Othin himself has over 200 heti, or titles, epithets we call him, among them being Ygr the Terrible, Runetyr, god of the runes. Freya has plenty of her own heti, including Vanadis, that is the Dis of the Vanir. So our gods don't necessarily exist in one particular cosmological function all the time, and it isn't the only requirement for a being to be called a god. I mean, if you worship it, at some point you could say, hey, that's my god or my goddess, no matter how big or small its cosmological function or its spheres of influence are. So in order to discern what a god is versus what a god is not, that's a really funny bit within heathenry, because there can be a bit of a sliding scale between spirits to gods, as I mentioned earlier with the example of god of river versus spirit of river. We tend to understand the gods as beings that we worship and have a cultist relationship with. So it isn't merely that this being has a cosmological function, we also take the extra step and we worship them. So we establish relationship with them, or they establish relationship with us, and the Gebo cycle, the gifting cycle, reciprocity, starts from there and then continues with offerings, with responses, whether it's direct response for spiritual experience or divination. There are a lot of ways that we can commune with our gods. So, but what is a god? So I'd probably break it down into three parts: cosmological function, a reciprocal relationship between itself, the being in question, and others, because it may not be our god, but it might be somebody's god. And it might not be a human's god, but it might be, say, maybe Ratatoskr is the god of squirrels. Maybe squirrels pay homage to Ratatoskr. Who knows? But it's an interesting thought experiment when you understand the world through a polytheist and animist point of view, in that we're not the only people, the only persons in creation. And whether or not something is a god is sometimes a matter of perspective, more so than like strict boundaries and strict rules. So you can have gods that also are ancestors. So within heathenry, there are three categories of overarching beings that we relate to, and that's gods, ancestors, and spirits. And a god can be a god and an ancestor, a god and a spirit, and vice versa. An ancestor could be a god. There are in the Swedish king annals, there are kings that relate back to, I believe it was Fjorgyn, in one of them, Frusti in the same annal. So the notion that we're not related to the gods is kind of goofy on its face, whether you take it from the Swedish King's Annals or whether you take it from the notion of the Rigsthula, where Rig, and that's either Heimdall or it's Othin, it depends on your perspective, but generally speaking, academics will say that's Heimdall, where he goes and he sleeps with the archetypal people who make up the class system in a Norse and Icelandic ancient heathen society. So gods might have specific relationships with human beings, they might not. For instance, a lot of folks will say, well, in order for somebody to recognize a god as a god, it needs to have a positive relationship with humanity. And I don't think that's necessarily always true, but it does tend to be true. Again, I look at Surt, who is like the primordial god of fire, the first being out of Muspelheim, the first being out of the Gununga Gap. And you can have an adversarial relationship with fire, but from my perspective, he's still a being worthy of worship because he gets that primordial fire started. He is part of the creation and part of how the worlds, including ours, get started. Without the heat of Muspelheim, there would be no melting of Niflheim. There would be no knock-on effects of the sun coming out of Muspelheim and so on and so forth, and all the wonderful things that Suna brings in her role as bringing the sun across the skies. So there's a lot of understanding that can be had. It depends on your particular theological perspective, of course. Some folks say worshiping the Jotnar is straight out, others recognize them quite readily as gods, and some folks pick and choose in between those extremes. But the overarching heathen perspective is that the clans of the Aesir and the Vanir are gods, and some folks include the Jotnar as gods as well. I am one of them. And I do so unapologetically for a lot of the reasons I just mentioned, and personal experience, but also there's so much intermarriage between the Aesir and the Jotnar, it seems goofy to me on its face to discriminate against worshipping Jotnar, especially when Jorth is the earth beneath our feet and Thor's mother. So how we reckon gods in heathenry is an individual thing, but I think that logically speaking we should include the third category of beings in Norse and Icelandic heathenry. Now, I'm not an Anglo-Saxon heathen, I can't speak to the Ettins. To wit, I understand the Ettins are more or less a devouring force that you want to keep away at all costs. But again, I'm not Anglo-Saxon, I can only speak to Norse heathenry. Now, what do we do with the gods? Well, we establish right relationship. What does that look like? Again, highly individual, because we have interesting complications with heathenry, because you can have what's called regional cultists. So you might understand Othin in a particular way in your neck of the woods. There might be certain gods and goddesses who have functions in control of weather events and things like that. Like somebody up north might relate really well to Skathi because she's goddess of hunting and skis, and snow is one of her primary elements that she feels comfortable in. And so you might have a unique relationship with her where somebody in Texas might have a really hard time connecting with Skathi as a goddess of snow, but they might really connect with her as a hunter goddess. So we can develop our relationships in different ways based not only on how we connect with the written sources and archaeology, but also how we connect with the gods on an individual level, where our interests intersect with their spheres of influence, their cosmological functions, and all that. Somebody who has just experienced a wildfire may not be all that excited about developing a relationship with Surt, or maybe they want to develop a better relationship with Surt so that they can better take care of their neck of the woods and fire control and have a better relationship with fire. So folks who might be developing relationships with God of, say, thunder and lightning, maybe you have a really powerful connection to storms and you feel the presence of a god in that storm. Or maybe you're just in awe of nature's majesty when you look outside and the sky is full of crackling electric spider webs. And you're like, wow, how cool. So a lot of folks come to the gods through a lot of different avenues. One that I haven't mentioned is popular culture. So a whole bunch of heathens have come to heathenry through Vikings, the TV show. I believe it's by History Channel, and also through the Marvel comics, through probably, I'm imagining that now that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is out, we're going to have a bunch of folks that get interested in heathenry through that avenue as well, and which is fine, just as long as you understand that those pieces of media might be useful connection points, but they're probably not going to be as accurate as, say, academic research or talking to your local heathen on the gods. And so, how do we relate to the gods? Well, the primary way that I relate to the gods is through the gifting cycle, and that includes prayers, and that includes gifts of offerings such as water, tobacco, mugwort, and other sacred herbs, through the gifting of mead, beer, and that kind of thing. So, and again, these are relationships that we are developing, both individually and communally. So you and your group, if you have one, in my case, our kindred, we took on the name Mimis Brunner, kindred. So Mimir is one of the gods that we especially give offerings to and honor to, with the understanding that no wisdom comes without sacrifice. So we relate to Mimir both as individual heathens and as a collective group. And so a lot of us hold cultus with a lot of the same gods, but we have a communal relationship with these gods as well as individual ones. So is there any one correct way? I wouldn't say so. I would say that if we absolutely had to nail this down to a single orthodox point of view, and that is a tall order, it would be that respect for the gods and reciprocity is key. But beyond that, orthopraxy, that is how you engage in that right relationship, is going to look different depending on who you are, what relationships you hold, and how you relate to the gods. So me trying to tell an Anglo-Saxon heathen how to relate to the gods is goofy on its face, because I can't have the same relationship. My cultural perspective is informed by Norse and Icelandic sources, and theirs is not. So the development of relationship with the gods is something that you are going to have to explore, and that I wish you the best of luck with, because it's a really wonderful journey. And I'm just excited that more and more folks are coming to this path and are exploring where the gods, ancestors, and spirits take them or have brought them. I think that, again, leaning on the discernment chapter that I just finished up last month, I think that having the spiritual accounting at the ready is going to be really, really helpful, discerning your relationship in a way that is healthy for you, your community, for your family, whatever your particular approach is going to be key. And it's part of why the discernment video went first before the gods, because when we start getting to people coming to heathenry with the gods involved, I know that in my case, discernment played a really big part in being able to separate ice cream from bullshit, and getting to trust my intuition with regards to the gods, and trusting that when I heard the voice of the gods, that wasn't just sock puppets. So that in and of itself is a long journey, and is something that you are going to probably need to have quite a bit of patience with yourself. I think your gods will have patience with you as long as you're doing the work of developing and keeping right relationship. So breathe, folks. This isn't a race. You're going to develop your relationships with your gods, ancestors, and Vatir at your own pace, and that is okay. So I'm going to leave it here, because I could go talking about the gods for hours. Long story short, the basics of the gods within heathenry are we're there to develop right relationship with them in this worldview of polytheism and animism, informed by our particular cultural worldview. So within the Norse and Icelandic worldview, that is very much informed the way that I understand them through the creation story and through the unfolding of how the world's come to be. And so from that baseline of Yorth being the Earth Mother that comes out of the slain body of Ymir, the primal giant, the first giant, the unfolding of a relationship is one where nothing really is gained without some kind of sacrifice, whether it's wisdom in regards to Mimir and Othin, or whether it's the work we have to put in so that we can put food on the table. We exist within this world to engage in and be in relationship with all the gods, ancestors, and Vatir that we can handle, and that we wish to forge relationships with, and that wish to forge relationships with us. So, without going too much further, because I could probably go at this for quite some time, I'm going to leave it here, and we're going to tackle ancestors in the next video. I'll see you then.